Hey everybody, it's Timothy here with Mana Rocks. Thanks for joining me today. We are going to do part 3 of our split-second set review for Core Set 2019, where I am going to review every black card in the set, common, uncommon, rare, and mythic rare, by just giving you 1 or 2 sentences about how I feel about the card. Remember, if you want a more in-depth explanation about any of the cards, feel free to comment below and I'll go ahead and tell you how I really feel about the cards, but we want something to just go by for our pre-releases and our first couple of drafts. Remember, these are in order of playability, so I'll have the worst black cards first and the best black cards at the end. So, with that being said, let's go and start our split-second set review for the black cards in Core Set 2019. Funny how all these set reviews keep starting off with some 1-mana rare card, but Infernal Reckoning is another card meant for older formats. Sure, it has some sideboard capabilities against artifact creatures, and black doesn't normally get that, but I think between Naturalize, Invoke the Divine, and Smelt, we should have artifacts covered, so not looking to pick this highly, and you probably shouldn't take it at all. Sovereign's Bite is the type of card that I'm willing to call just straight up unplayable from the get-go, unless the format is super aggro or the life gain decks are so insane that you need cards like this. You probably shouldn't pick it, and it's not going to be very impactful when you do. Duress is the type of card that I'm happy to have on my sideboard or to play main deck in sealed, but when it comes to draft, I'm not usually main decking a Duress unless I'm really low on playables. It's a fine, acceptable card, but it doesn't do too much, and it's better served as a sideboard option against control decks. I don't even remember what set Infernal Scarring was originally from, maybe Origins or Battle for Zendikar, but I remember it being pretty bad there, and I think it's going to be pretty bad here. There's a little bit of bounce, and the payoff you get for this aura is not worth just jamming it into any aggressive deck. It will replace itself if it sticks and the creature dies, but that doesn't work against bounce, and it's really not worth the upside that you get out of the card. Mind Rot's another card that's just fine as a main deckable card, but usually something you want to bring in against control decks or decks with really high curves rather than something you want to start out with. It doesn't affect the board, but it is a natural 2-for-1, so if your deck doesn't have a lot of card advantage, this is the type of card that can make up for it. Here's a rare that I'm not quite sure about yet, but it doesn't look particularly good to me. It's very hard to get a huge advantage off Frey and Omnipotence since it is a symmetrical effect, but if you can maneuver yourself in a position where you just have less than your opponent and you get affected by this less, it might do something relevant, but for the most part, I'm going to wait until the format ripens a bit and see how this plays out before I go first picking it. Bog Stomper is an odd card to have for black. 6 mana, 6/5 vanilla is really not what black decks want, and I would save the big stompy creatures for the green or red decks. Tomb Dissenter is a sweet card in the Sacrifice deck. If you have a way to take advantage of the body, or if that zombie creature type matters for the token, then I could see this going up in your estimations a little bit, but in just an average black deck, it's not a particularly good card, more of just a speed bump for the opponent to get through. Stitcher Supplier highlights the self-mill strategy in black, where there are a lot of reanimation spells and ways to manipulate your graveyard for advantage. If you don't have those cards, then Supplier is pretty bad overall, but if you do have those cards, then this card's value goes up a slight bit. It's not an impactful body, but it does stock up the graveyard for your other cards. Walking Corpse is a bear. That's basically all I can say about it. It is a zombie, which is going to matter for 3 or 4 other cards, so you might pick it higher with other things, but it's not a card you're clamoring to pick up, and it's usually going to wheel out of most packs. Vampire Neonate fits the life gain deck pretty nicely, but does have a pretty hefty mana cost attached to it, so if you have things that continuously trigger off you gaining life, I would definitely pick this up, but if you're really just in the market for a 0/3, then you can do better. Especially at 1 mana, this doesn't impact the board too heavily, and the mana investment for the ability is a little bit of a hassle. Hired Blade is our Pounce and Cheetah of the set, except it's an assassin here to kill you instead of just a cat. It's not a particularly great card, but also not terrible, and usually one of the last cards you'll pick to fill in your slots in your deck. It only has 2 toughness, so the surprise factor of Flash is a little bit lost on that, but it still has Flash, which is a pretty decent ability to have on a creature. Diregraph Ghoul being uncommon is really surprising to me, since this is the type of card you want in excess of in the decks that want to play it in the first place. Being a zombie matters a little bit, but having 1 mana 2/2s is what a lot of aggro decks want. Unfortunately, you can't get critical mass with this being an uncommon here, and it's a pretty bad top deck, so really only play it if you're absolutely dedicated to an aggro deck. Ravenous Harpy is one of the linchpins of the sacrifice deck in red and black. It's very bad outside of that, since you don't want to be sacrificing just everyday normal creatures, but if you have things like Doomed Dissenter or Active Treason to take an opponent's creature, then Ravenous Harpy is going to pull a lot of weight. Otherwise, it's not a card you really want at all. Two-Headed Zombie is one of our go-to generic fantasy creatures of the set, and that's just fine. 4 mana, 4/2 Menace, not much to say about it. 2 toughness on a Menace creature is not amazing, but it does beat pretty hard against people who only have 1 creature on board. So in a zombie deck, I'm happy to take this, and otherwise, I could take it or leave it. Infectious Horror is interesting. It's a zombie, so it's got that going for it, but it's often going to trade down for an opponent's 2 or 3 drop. Where this gets really good is if you can give it evasion, and there are a couple cards in blue and white that can get this past blockers, so look for ways to make it unblockable or give it fly-in to really capitalize on its ability. Rise from the Grave is the type of card that really pulls its weight against big creature decks, especially green decks, and plays very nicely in green-black where you usually have access to a bunch of big creatures. If you have ways to mill yourself, this card goes way up in value, and it's just decent on its own. Keep in mind it does produce a zombie, which might matter for some of your cards. I really liked Supernatural Stamina from Amonkhet block. It was a very efficient combat trick and usually lets you reuse Enter the Battlefield triggers when the creature died. Abnormal Endurance is the same card for 1 more mana, and I expect it to play out basically the same. Be on the lookout for this card on your pre-release. If you run into it unknowingly, you might get blown out. Child of Night is a fine card. It's not exceptional, and some people value it way too highly in formats like this. It does fall off in the late game, but in an aggro deck, it's pretty good, and it will fit the black-white life gain deck pretty nicely. 1 toughness can be a liability, and that's what really scares me about the Child of Night here. Alright, here's our Reassembling Skeleton, probably one of the most important black cards, not necessarily the strongest, but most synergistic cards in the set. If you want a little more information about what this card does and how it works with a lot of the rares and commons in this set, go ahead and check out my video on the top 10 build-around cards for the core set. But for now, just know that it's a decent chump blocker, it's good sacrifice fodder, and it does work very well with a lot of other cards in this set. Open the Graves intrigues me. It has the potential to be very bad, especially against flyer decks or decks that aren't killing your creatures but rather just blocking them forever. In most mid-range matchups where your creatures are trading off, it's definitely going to pull its weight, but just know that this is very matchup dependent. It does get better if you can sacrifice your own creatures for value, but it does take a lot of mana to get it started in the first place. Nightmare's Thirst is the type of card that goes way up on this list if you have multiple ways to gain life in your deck. Without that, it is going to pick off 1 toughness creature, so this is one of the things I'm saying watch out for when you pick up those small toughness creatures. But I think Nightmare's Thirst is going to be one of the best removal spells in this format. Probably shouldn't get very late in a pack either. Macabre Waltz is a pet card of mine. I really like these card advantage engines in black decks. This is going to get you creatures back from your graveyard, works very well in the self-mill strategies, and sure, it does require you to discard a card, but sometimes you can use that to your advantage. I pick this card pretty medium to highly in most decks, and a lot of people don't value it highly, so you can probably get it late. Skeleton Archer is another one of those ways to pick off 1 toughness creatures in this format. It is a hill giant if it's not really doing anything, and it's always going to get at least a damage on the opponent if it doesn't kill a creature, but I think the upside on this card is definitely worth it, and it's a nice common to have floating around. Epicure of Blood is one of the key cards you're looking for the life gain deck, turning all of your life gain into life loss for the opponent, well, 1 life at a time. It's not a fantastic card if you don't have other ways to gain life, hence it's being a little bit low on this list. But if you're in that sort of deck, if you're playing black-white, this is the type of creature you're looking for. Well, speaking of card advantage, we have a literal black divination here. It does require you to sacrifice a creature, and it is sorcery speed, so a little bit clunky, but 3 cards is definitely worth it. You're looking for cards like Reassembling Skeleton and Doomed Dissenter in order to really take advantage of this card. Alright, here's the black horse in our cycle of horses, this one being a Nightmare. Like I said, much cooler creature types than just horse, right? 3 mana 2/2, and it is going to shrink all of your opponent's creatures as another way to punish those 1 toughness creatures, plus sometimes just lets you push through. It has pseudo-evasion against white, and it's very good against token decks, so be on the lookout for this card when you're playing against the go-wide strategies in the format. Similar to Sarkhan in our red review, Liliana Untouched by Death is another planeswalker that cares almost exclusively about a certain tribe. If you're very heavy on zombies, then Liliana is great, which makes it a great first pick since you can draft around it a little bit, but if you only have 2 to 3 zombies in your deck, it loses a ton of value. I mentioned in my build around video that the +1 is really the crux of the card and can help fuel these graveyard synergies, but if you don't have a lot of those, then Liliana is really just not the card you're looking for limited. Can someone do me a huge favor and send me a screenshot of somebody winning with Liliana's contract and 4 Demon of Catastrophes on board? I would absolutely love that. I will literally pay you for it. But in all seriousness, this is 5 mana to draw 4 cards for 4 life, which is a fantastic deal in a slower control deck and not particularly good against aggro decks. I'm always playing this card, probably first picking it, but taking it out against hyper-aggressive decks. Felspectre has a pretty inefficient body overall. It doesn't beat very hard, but it does get value on coming in, and it does get better in multiples, so be on the lookout for extra Felspectres after you play the first one. It does combo with cards like Duress and Mind Rot, but it's not really a good reason to play those in your main deck. Similar to Liliana here, we have Death Baron, which is our zombie lord for the set, and even doubles as a skeleton lord, which there are maybe 2 or 3 of in the set. It's not a good card on its own since it doesn't get its own pump, but if you can manage to draft a couple more zombies in addition to this one, it definitely pulls its weight and makes combat very difficult for your opponent. I absolutely love Skymarch Bloodletter in Ixalan block, and I imagine it's going to be just as good here. It does lose its synergy focus as opposed to Ixalan block, but it's still an efficient flyer here, deals damage, and even fits that white-black life gain deck pretty nicely. Gravedigger's back for the first time since Amonkhet block, and I imagine it's going to be just as good here as it has been in any other format. It's a great way to take advantage of those self-mill strategies. Good middle to late game card advantage creature, and the type of card that a lot of decks will often splash for. Keep in mind, 2 Gravediggers can recur each other infinitely if you have the resources to do that. I expect Vampire Sovereign's probably one of the best uncommons in the set, especially as far as creatures go. It's an efficient flyer, it blocks pretty well, and it gets that 3 damage in right away, plus gains you a little bit of life back, making it a great stabilizer. Don't expect to see this card after the first couple picks in a draft. Phylactery Lich is the type of card that takes a little bit of work before it really gets going in a match, but can take over a game, so definitely justifies the work you have to put in for it. Triple black is a real cost, and having an artifact on board matters, plus the artifact can get blown up and take the Lich out with it, but this card can take over a game on its own, so I think it's a puzzle worth trying to figure out for your limited deck. Izzet the Awakener is an efficient little creature here. Even without the ability, a 3-mana 3/3 Death Touch is an annoying card for the opponent to deal with since it attacks and blocks pretty well, and it doesn't have to deal combat damage to activate its ability, it simply has to attack. So oftentimes this will be a source of card advantage, and your opponent's going to be incentivized to block it right away, so look for ways to reanimate this repetitively. Strangling Spores is 4 mana to give something -3/-3 until end of turn at instant speed, and is probably one of the better common spells in this format. Keep in mind you can use it as a combat trick to take out bigger creatures if it doesn't straight up kill those creatures, something that a lot of newer players tend to forget about. It's similar to Electrify, it'll go middle pack and be a good sign that black is open in the draft. Just a notch above our previous card is Lich's Caress, which is our 5 mana unconditional destroy target creature, and even has some life gain attached to it. So these black cards really punish the aggressive strategies when they gain you life back and add to the board. I imagine this is probably the best black card for commons in the set, so be on the lookout for it. And one step above that is Murder, 3 mana to unequivocally destroy target creature at instant speed. It is hard to splash, so you could get rewarded if you're in black, but this is a card that tends to go first or second out of most packs. Another zombie here, we have Graveyard Marshal, which is a fantastic beater on turn 2 and has a lot of late game advantage. Keep in mind this is another creature that takes advantage of you filling up your own graveyard, so once you start the draft off with this, look for cards that can do that. It's good early, it's good late, and it has the potential to just take over a game on its own, so definitely a card I'm looking to first pick. Demon of Catastrophes is one of the best rares in the set by far. It does require that you sacrifice a creature, so it's pretty bad against bounce and removal in general, but against red-green decks and decks that only have damage-based removal, it's very hard for them to deal with this, and it comes down early enough that it can just take over and win a game on its own. Very strong card. I would be willing to first pick this for sure, and then look for ways to make that sacrifice less of a cost and more of an advantage. And that leaves us with Bone Dragon, which I consider to be the best black card in the set. It's a very efficient flyer, 5 damage per turn with evasion for just 5 mana is already great, and then it has an ability to recur itself. Keep in mind, there's not a lot of ways to exile creatures in this format, so being able to deal with the Bone Dragon is a lot harder than it looks. Again, it plays very well with self-mill, since that fuels your graveyard to get it back, and this card is the type of thing that can easily take over a game. Look for things like Luminous Bond to take care of it permanently. And that's going to take care of our split-second review for all the black cards in Core Set 2019. Thanks for joining me, as always, and we'll be putting up a couple more of these videos throughout the next couple days. Remember, you can like, comment, and subscribe here on YouTube at Mana Rocks, or you can find us on Twitter at MTG_Mana Rocks, where I'd love to chat with people. So go ahead and find us there. Be tuned throughout the rest of the week for the rest of this series, and as always, thanks for watching.